So, did you always want to become an actor? How did you first get into acting?
Well, I wanted to become an actor when I was a schoolboy. I was torn between that and being a painter, and my father wouldn't hear of it. So the nearest approach to either that I was allowed to be in any form of artistic career was to be trained as an architect. Well, I very quickly discovered that I was not cut out for that because I simply couldn't do the sums. As I've just said, I was enumerative. My father having been a mathematician and always having said that the boy's an idiot and he can't add 2 and 2 together. So, I suppose that, does that answer your question?
Oh, yes, yes. So there'd been no acting background in your family at all before yourself?
I did have a grandmother who was in the doily cart when she was a very young woman. What she did in the doily cart I was never able to discover.
So can you remember what your actual first stage production was, your first acting role?
My first acting role professionally?
Yes.
My first acting role professionally was right at the end of the war, Robert Browning in the Ballads of Wimpole Street in Weekly Rep, which was my first job.
And you mentioned the war there. Do you have any particular memories of the war? Did that get in the way of your ambitions to be an actor at all?
Well, it certainly got in the way because I was in the army for 4 years when I could have been being an actor. So yes, it did. The war certainly got in the way. It certainly in no way advanced my career. I wasn't able. I never found myself in a situation as watching John Ballon's tape last night, where he was able to produce plays on an aircraft carrier in a situation like that. I've spent most of my war stuck in the African bush.
Was there any particular film you may have seen when you were young and seeing an actor perform that may have inspired you to want to emulate that actor and become an actor yourself? As a kid, I was always very fond of films. I used to love historical films. I mean, they were quite bad films, and I've kept copies of them, things like Marlene Dietrich and The Scarlet Empress, which was a marvellous extravaganza. We sort of filmed against Russian gargoyles and marvellous interiors of St. Petersburg, and it was she was wonderful. And of course, television was in its infancy back then. How did you become involved in television? When did that come about?
Well, I became involved in television rather late. I was a stage actor, and I kept saying to my agent, "Look, when the hell am I going to get into television?" He said, "Oh, it'll happen." I said, "When the hell, what's more, am I ever going to get into films?" So he said, "It'll happen." I didn't really believe him. But then one day, the BBC. In the very early days of live television, rang me up and they said they were going to do Markheim, Robert Louis Stevenson's novelette, and it was going to be directed by someone who'd never directed before, who turned out to be Tony Richardson.
I've actually read about Markheim in the Radio Times. It was described at the time as a taut study in the macabre, a tale of temptation and murder. And it also mentions it was set in an antique shop and had very little dialogue, so that must have been an unusual television. It had very little dialogue and was set in an antique shop, so it must have been an unusual type of television production anyway.
Well, as it was my first experience, I had nothing to gauge it by. But I suppose it was unusual. It was a complete crib, actually. Stevenson lifted the whole idea and plot from Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, of the antique shop or the junk shop, of the woman that gets murdered, the worthless person who is murdered for money by a struggling student.
So was that an education for you, suddenly working in television as compared to working on stage? Presumably your movements had to be different because you didn't have the freedom.
Well, we were very restricted. We couldn't sort of wander about much. You know, we had to. I can't remember, but I remember it was very, very restricting and felt very unnatural. And I found it incredibly difficult.